Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts and comments that I have in a casual conversation and discussion format with regard to my experiences of these films that are in the Friday the 13th series. And today, specifically, I'd like to talk about this film, which is, according to the back of this Blu-ray, from 2003, from Ronnie Yu. This is Freddy versus Jason. Now, as I indicated, and as with these videos in the past, this is not meant to be any comprehensive review of the film. It's just meant to be a casual talk about my experiences watching this film. Also, I will be talking about plot spoilers, so again, just for your information. And also, this is in keeping with that great Blu-ray box set that was released by Shout Factory a few months back. Freddy vs. Jason. So this is from the early 2000s, and I should maybe let you know that I was very excited when this film was released, and I went to see it in the theater upon its initial release, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great time at the movies. So thinking about that time, or thinking about the build-up to the eventual release of the film in the theaters, we have to remember, of course, that we have essentially, right, not essentially, we basically have, or fundamentally, we have two film franchises or horror film series that are now combining into one film expression, that is Freddy vs. Jason. So of course, those two series are Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. So for anyone who was a fan of the horror genre during the 80s and into the 90s, of course, A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th were among the most popular of these films during this time. And so it was always in the air, friends talking and imagining what it could be like to see a film. Who would win in a battle between Freddy versus Jason? Who is stronger? Who has strengths here versus Freddy's wit and Machiavellian style versus Jason brute force strength? Who would win in this battle of what eventually became horror icons in this type of cinema? So this was always in the air as far as fan circles and also discussions among friends and the like. And then we got the emergence of the Friday the 13th films into or under the New Line Cinema umbrella when we get into the 1990s. And so we get, they weren't called Friday the 13th anymore. Of course, they were called Jason. So Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, and onwards. So we have the character and the story of this mythology, this cinematic mythology, now under the umbrella of New Line Cinema. And we also have to remember that A Nightmare on Elm Street, that series was also under the New Line Cinema umbrella from the very beginning of that series. So we now have these two series under the same umbrella, that is New Line Cinema. So that, I think, was a very significant contributing factor to the raising of the anticipation levels during the 1990s as to the possibility of if and when a Freddy Jason crossover film would come. Also, of course, we have to remember that at the end of Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, we got that really great teaser image of the glove grabbing onto the mask. And so this was, I think, official confirmation, if ever there was one, in cinematic terms, in visual cinematic terms, that indeed a Freddy vs. Jason film would be on the way. So that was at the early 90s. And also thinking about A Nightmare on Elm Street, when we get into the 90s, we also see Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, and also Wes Craven's A New Nightmare. And I think it's fascinating, especially how those two films ended up. I think there was this feeling too that maybe that was the end of that series, at least as far as that particular time period is concerned. And so we have Freddy Krueger at the end of that series, at least in the early 90s, and also Jason Voorhees at the end of the early 90s with Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. And so the feeling in the air was very palpable and very real as to the possibility of this. Again, from a fan point of view, this was very exciting. But of course, as we know, as we get into the 90s and into the 2000s, there was no cinematic reincarnation, or there was no cinematic representation of this crossover that we saw in that decade. And then into the 2000s, what did we see? We saw Jason X. And so what was to come as far as this crossover, this apparently promised crossover between these two horror icons? So, but still, the anticipation levels were very high. And so when the news came as to this film and when it was eventually released, it was really exciting. And I remember the theater experience, going to the theater. It was, I think, a fairly packed audience, and everyone was into it. They were laughing and they were screaming. Sometimes they were laughing with the film, sometimes they were laughing at the film. But I think even that is part of the entertainment value and experience of a film like this. And the evidence, I think, was there in terms of people really having a good time and vocalizing that in terms of their expressions and their reactions as they were watching it in real time. So, and for me too, it was a really fun time at the movies. So as a visceral piece of entertainment, it worked really well, and it works very well, because not only do we get the fulfillment of this anticipation and the promise of what we saw essentially at the end of Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, we also get this crossover between these two horror titans. And this is a crossover too that is very much part of, say, the Hollywood cinematic experience, because there are many instances outside of the horror genre, Freddy versus Jason, or even elsewhere, and even up to recently, where we have different characters from different franchises coming together into one film. And so, but even back in the early days of early horror films, this was a really, I think, a great sort of a great type of a crossover tradition in Hollywood cinema and the like. And so Freddy vs. Jason is in many ways another great example of this crossover tradition in Hollywood entertainment. Also, it has undoubtedly and undeniably that professional wrestling, pro wrestling type of vibe to it, as a battle between titans, a clash of the titans, as it were. And these two are, in essence, heels, right, in the parlance of professional wrestling. And so it was like watching two really famous bad guys of cinema go at it in this really grueling, brutal match to the death, really. And so that had the feel of a professional wrestling or pro wrestling match. You know, it's like, I don't know, like maybe Jason Voorhees is like The Undertaker, or Freddy Krueger is like, I don't know, like maybe like the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase or something like that, for anyone who knows the WWE. So it had that type of these strong characters coming together, and they are going to fight it out. And so that also contributed to, I think, the visceral thrill and entertainment of this film when it was released. And it was, as I say, a great time at the movies. There is also, I think, the other side of the coin when it comes to viewing this film over a long period of time. And that goes to the longevity of the film and the promise of the film, and how the film specifically sits in the filmographies of each of these franchises respectively. In other words, how consistent is this film when we look at it as a Friday the 13th film, and how consistent is this film when we look at it as a Nightmare on Elm Street film? And I think that's another very interesting question entirely. And I think maybe depending on your own viewpoints and perspectives on this film, maybe there might be a varying degree of different opinion as to whether this film sits consistently in these horror series, or maybe this film instead works better as its own standalone film, that is still undoubtedly borrowing some elements from these two franchises respectively. So however you view it, I think still ultimately it's a really interesting question. How much of a Friday the 13th film is this, and how much of a Nightmare on Elm Street film this is? And I think for me, in order to try to answer that question, I think obviously we have to look at the characters and how they are depicted in this film and compare that to how they were depicted in the films leading up or in the series themselves. So let's start with Jason Voorhees, right, in this film. How is he depicted in this film versus how has he been depicted in past Friday the 13th films? So already we have the notion of Jason Voorhees coming back to life through some means of power that is being displayed and inflicted by Freddy Krueger. Now, we're not quite sure as to the specific machinations of that. And also, there isn't any specific backstory provided in this film per se as to how, if at all, this Jason might connect with the continuity of the Jason Voorhees storyline that we saw in past films. Jason X, or even Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, or even Part 8, and even prior to that. So it's not quite clear how the film addresses that, if at all. Of course, as fans, and people who are experts in the Friday the 13th lore, I think there are clues and ways to try to, if one wants to, establish a link of continuity between this Jason and the Jason of past films. That's certainly possible. And I think many people who are much better experts in the Friday the 13th mythology than I think have created maybe some great theories about that. But also it's possible to see this Jason as its own standalone with some linkages to the mythology or the remnants or the rumors or the feelings of the mythology on a broad level that we understand from past films. So it's possible to maybe try to establish continuity specifically, or it's possible to look at it just as there is the Jason myth, and while the details might be a little bit maybe unclear, still there is this general sense of this being the same Jason Voorhees, right? After all, we did get in past films, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, and Jason X, the start of those films not necessarily giving us the specific backstory as to how Jason came back from the dead after the prior film, right? So we didn't get that backstory as to what happened to Jason at the end of Part 8, at the start of the 9th film. And we certainly didn't get that at the start of the 10th film, if we recall. So he just is there, and he just emerges, and he just is, because he is Jason Voorhees. And so I think a similar type of leeway can be allowed when we remember how Jason essentially is introduced in this film. So there is that room for I think a broad sense of interpretation, and I think that's part of the fun when we're trying to think about these films, especially in the latter half or the latter part of this New Line Cinema era. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing, too, is that we do get all of the traits and hallmarks of the Jason Voorhees character, what he does, the carnage that he wreaks upon this community at large, the outrageous levels of violence that almost reach these overblown comic levels of and so that becomes, I think, part of the Jason mythology, especially during the recent run of Jason films. And also we get the mythology, we get the representation of Mrs. Voorhees, although we understand that this is a manipulation by Freddy Krueger himself. So this is how Freddy Krueger is using Jason Voorhees for his own means. But we do get these representations of Mrs. Voorhees, which brings me to a really interesting point about this film. There is a lot of the subjective viewpoint of Jason Voorhees, the character expressed in this film, through the dreams and through the visions that we understand are from Jason's POV directly. Another example of that being, there is a moment where we see his perspective on the victims and how they all morph into each other, and then they ultimately become representations of what he thinks his mother is saying to him. Although, again, as I indicated before, this is, we understand, part of how Freddy is using Jason in this film. Okay, but we do get the subjective viewpoint. We get a lot of it, too. Now, maybe it might be that this film is getting more of that subjective viewpoint than in past Friday the 13th films. And if you feel that way, I think that's a very reasonable perspective to hold. But also, I think back on past Friday the 13th films, and we did get a number of moments where it could be said that we got the subjective viewpoint of Jason. Of course, from a technical camera perspective, there are moments of POV, and so sometimes maybe the POV is very directly Jason's POV. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But also, there are some moments, say in part 2, where we actually get the perspective of Jason, remember, with images of his mother and the sweater in that film. Also in films like, say, part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, there are moments that I think can be interpreted to be Jason's point of view or Jason's perspective, especially how the young boy version of Jason is handled in that film. And so there are those moments. I think also what's interesting about Freddy vs. Jason is that arguably there is room to look at Jason as a character in a somewhat sympathetic light. And we have seen moments in the past where it could be said that Jason is maybe depicted in a somewhat sympathetic light. Let's recall Jason Lives, part 6. There's a moment with the kids, the campers, and how this could be interpreted to be Jason thinking back to one of his moments as a young boy. And that could be said to be maybe a moment where we can look at him in a sympathetic way. Also, this way of looking at him in a sympathetic light, I think, continues on in, say, part 8. Also, the way that Kane Hodder, in the past versions of the Jason films, or the Friday the 13th films, portrayed him, there seemed to be this sense of use of body language that could also be, in a way, in a very interesting way, humanizing the character from a certain point of view. Okay, so in these ways, in the past films, it could be argued that indeed there have been moments where Jason has been seen in a somewhat sympathetic light, or the Jason's subjective point of view. Here, we get those in very large doses, and to the point where it seems like it could be said that of these two horror icons, the film seems to be maneuvering itself in a way that allows the viewer maybe to look at Jason versus Freddy and maybe want to side with Jason, or maybe feel sorry for him or be more sympathetic with his point of view versus Freddy's point of view. And I think that's even further augmented by the way that the dream sequence of Jason is depicted in this film. We get Freddy exploiting his weakness, Jason's weakness. We get Freddy and his access to the very traumatizing moment of Jason being tormented and made fun of by the other kids at the camp, and the counselors ignoring what was going on and how that's connected to what happened to him in the lake. So there is this way that this subjective viewpoint is applied in this film, and it creates this room for sympathy. So that's an interesting way that this film maybe on the one hand connects with past Friday the 13th films, but also maybe could be said to be standing in its own sense, or standing on its own, in its own sensibilities, as far as the depiction of the Jason Voorhees character. So that's one thing. The other thing, too, that's interesting is how Jason has a weakness in this film. And we understand in this film, it's water. So Jason is apparently afraid of water, and Freddy exploits this. Now, whether this is really consistent with past Friday the 13th films is really up to you. I guess it makes sense because of what happened to Jason as a young boy. And if we think about how this connected with some kind of trauma, then maybe water as a reminder of this trauma as a young boy, I think that could make sense. And I think it does in the context of this film, Freddy vs. Jason. But it's also interesting to think back on other past Friday the 13th films to the moments where Jason was in fact in the water, and there didn't seem to be any indication of him being scared at the time. So, for example, in part 8, when they get off the boat and get into New York Harbor, Jason also apparently was able to swim from the boat to the harbor by himself in a really a fantastic show of physical dexterity, and he's able to swim in that film. Also, in part 6, he has no hesitation to go into the lake and go after Tommy in the boat there at the climax of the film. Also in part 4, or the fourth film, Friday the 13th final chapter, there's a moment where the young woman is in the raft in the middle of the lake at night, and suddenly Jason emerges, and so we didn't see indication of Jason being scared of the water in those instances. But I think we can go along with the ride as far as what Freddy versus Jason is trying to establish, at least as far as how Freddy can use that to his advantage and exploit his fear, Jason's fear. Okay, but so in these and other ways, I think there is really room for nice discussion and debate as to whether this is truly a film that can sit comfortably in the canon of Friday the 13th films, or does it really sit on its own, maybe as a unique depiction of Jason Voorhees, but still separate from the series, or maybe it's a hybrid of the two approaches. Again, I think it's up to you and how you view this film and the Friday the 13th franchise. A similar or almost identical type of analysis can be applied to the Nightmare on Elm Street side of things, the Freddy Krueger side of things, right? So is this the same Freddy Krueger that we have seen in past films? Now, there is an interesting way that the Nightmare on Elm Street films go from film to film to film to film. And sometimes there is an effort to really establish a strong continuity link between what happened at the end of the last film and what happens at the beginning of this film. So, for instance, I think that kind of continuity exists, say, from the end of Part 3, Dream Wars, to the beginning of Part 4, The Dream Master. Certainly, and then it goes from the end of Part 4, The Dream Master, to the beginning of Part 5, The Dream Child. But then there are other instances where I think that link of continuity is not necessarily established at the start of the film. So maybe that's the case at, say, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, and also Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. And I think Wes Craven's A New Nightmare is a really interesting, has a unique approach to this point on an almost meta level. But my general point is that sometimes the films try to establish that continuity, and other times they don't. It really depends on what film you're thinking of or dealing with at the time. Here in Freddy vs. Jason, Freddy just is. He has always been there. So there isn't, just like the Jason character, there isn't the film trying to establish, strictly speaking, a strong link of continuity. He just is there. And so I think it's up to us as viewers to try, if we want to interpret this and try to establish, again, if we want to, a chain of continuity. If we want to, then I think that can be a fun exercise. If not, that's fine too. But I think that also plays into, or potentially anyway, as to how we see this film and how it fits into the Nightmare on Elm Street world, or perhaps it sits in its own continuity on its own. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. As far as the Freddy Krueger character is concerned, he seems to look the same, although there is, I think, quite noticeably a slight makeup, if you want to call it upgrade or redesign. It does feel the same, although there are some aspects of the makeup that I think are quite different here. The teeth, in particular, as an example of that. But other ways he seems to be the same Freddy Krueger in terms of the look and the appearance. Although, as I said, there are some differences here and there, which I think make for a very interesting conversation among Nightmare fans. Is it the same character? I think we have, on the one hand, a number of ways that the character is very consistent with what we saw in the past. And we see these really strong linkages with past films. So, for example, the Freddy character himself seems to be very much reliant on how people fear him or don't fear him. And if people don't fear him or people don't know him, then he is very weak, which is where we find him at the start of the film. This is, of course, paralleling quite directly the first film, Nightmare on Elm Street, and how in that film the key was fearing him or not fearing him. And so, if you recall the conversation, right, between the Heather Langenkamp character and the Johnny Depp character, right, about how if you don't fear him, you take away his power and he disappears. And so that became the crux of how to defeat Freddy in that first film. You fear him or you don't fear him. And then this film, Freddy vs. Jason, it's almost the reverse. We start with a state of him not being remembered, and then it builds up to him being remembered and him being feared, which brings him essentially back to life and resuscitates him. So it's almost a mirror image of the first film, but it's still, I think, a strong parallel and connection. Another parallel and connection is maybe with the lore that was built up with the film Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and Weston Hills, and even to references specifically to, say, Hypnosil, which we saw for the first time in that film as the dream suppressant drug, excuse me. And it becomes, as we know, a very strong plot point in this film, as does Weston Hills as well. Even that whole thing with the references to group and also dreams and the inside of this institution, etc. This is very much, I think, in visual terms, similar to what we saw in Part 3. And of course, that mythology continues through that cycle of films, Part 3, Part 4, and Part 5. And also there's the idea of Freddy being taken out of his dreams and being brought out into the real world, which is a very important aspect of Part 1. And also the sixth film, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. So that's also a linkage that's very strong. And even there's a linkage with Part 2, I would suggest, because in Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, there is this idea of Freddy being able to possess someone in the real world. In that film, it was Jesse, if you recall. And so here in this film, there's a little moment of possession of someone in the real world, and how Freddy is able to inhabit the body of someone. That has strong Freddy's Revenge vibes, I think, and so there is a possible linkage with that film. So in these and other ways, I think there are strong connections with the past films, thus making it, I think, a strong contender for sitting quite consistently in the world of Nightmare on Elm Street. There are other aspects, I would suggest, though, that make it maybe very unique or stand separate from the depiction of Freddy Krueger in past films. I think the one element of the Freddy character in this film that is, I think, strikingly different from the past Freddy Krueger depictions in the films up to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, I would suggest, is the level of sexual menace that the character has. Now, I would argue that the level of sexual menace in the character inherently regarding Freddy Krueger might have been there from the very beginning, and there might have been hints of it here and there, but I would also suggest that there were never any direct references made to this kind of threat or menace aspect of Freddy Krueger in those films. Whereas here in this film, Freddy vs. Jason, while it's not apparent throughout, there are moments that are actually quite disturbing when it comes to this depiction of Freddy Krueger in terms not just of the violence, but also the sexual violence and menace that his character seems to bring. And so that, I think, is very pronounced here, much more than, say, in past films, I would suggest. And so maybe that's another way to look at this film as being a different depiction of the Freddy Krueger character, as being, and making this another argument that this film is its own separate entity. Or maybe for others, maybe you view the Freddy Krueger character and see that from the very beginning. But so again, that's another aspect that I think is there as well. So in these and other ways, I think the debate and discussion is really there as to whether this sits in the canon, or whether it stands off and is just its own separate universe. And however you view it, I think still ultimately it can, I mean, at the very least, there is room for that discussion. And always this kind of discussion is part of the fun when thinking about these horror franchises and the series. And also, even if you look at the film as being a totally separate thing, it doesn't sit in the universe of Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street at all, it's its own separate thing. Still, I think there's potential, as I was indicating at the start of this video, as to the visceral thrill and entertainment impact of seeing, as I say, these two horror icons together in what is essentially like a pro wrestling match between two heels, and seeing who will end up the victor. and this fight to the death, as it were. It's almost like a cage match in many ways, and it has various levels to it as well. This dream level of fight, which is round one, I suppose, and then round two, which is out in the real world, and all the violence and carnage, the horror genre mayhem that occurs throughout the remaining parts of the film. And so I think there are these two ways to look at it, at least from my point of view. And however you feel, I think ultimately it comes down to where you are as far as your takes on these respective film franchises accordingly. Again, if you don't like these films, chances are that you probably won't like Freddy vs. Jason, and that's okay. I can completely get that. But also, if you are a fan of these films and you have been watching these films from the early days, then I think chances are there's a lot to like about this film. And there's, at the very least, a lot of room for discussion, as I was trying to suggest before. So I think those are the main reasons, or those are the main ways that I look at this film, Freddy vs. Jason. And so it remains, as I say, a very entertaining time at the movies. And it's very, almost in terms of horror genre history, it's quite a moment in this series of cinema incarnations. So this is Freddy vs. Jason. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.